First of all, just to say a massive thank you for making it out of what I'm sure was a warm bed this morning on a cold winter's morning to join us. And by way of introduction, as Jess said, my name is Esther. I'm part of the team that helped to lead IJM, International Justice Mission, here in the UK. I'm based in Durham, but my team work all across the UK, and I have the privilege of connecting with colleagues and partners all around the world. But my home is the Northeast. I'm a southerner that moved north and then realised the north is really the place to be. And I've been here for about 15 years. Now this morning, we are going to explore together what the invitation that we find throughout the Bible to live a life of justice, what that might mean today in 2023. And by way of a direction of travel for our justice journey this morning, and we're going to start by exploring what we actually mean by the word justice and what a biblical view of justice might look like. And after we've done that, we're then going to dive into some of the more kind of practical elements and explore one issue of injustice, and that is the issue of modern day slavery. We're going to use that as a bit of a case study as to what justice might look like. And I think once we've got the what of justice in place, the how becomes a little bit easier, right? So that's our kind of direction of travel. I'm going to be drawing upon my work with IJM as an example, although I hope that what I share can encourage you in whatever area of justice you feel called to this morning. After the break, we're going to have a chance for some Q&A as well. So please be jotting down, making a note as you go if there are things that you'd like to ask, so that we can have a discussion together as we travel through this morning. Now, I just wanted to let you know as we start that some of the situations that IJM work in are particularly dark. I am going to be drawing upon some statistics and some stories of exploitation and abuse. Nothing explicit, but please do handle that as you need. If you need to come and go, grab a drink, please do. Don't stand on ceremony here. I hope that all sounds okay. Great. Thank you. Now, before we dive into the what of justice, I wanted to start a little bit by framing as to why this conversation matters. And to do that, I would love to introduce you to a remarkable young woman whose story I have come to know recently. And her name is Ruby. Now, I can't show you a picture of her face. You'll see a photo in just a moment. If you flick forward a couple of slides. One more, we'll get there. There we go, thank you. I can't show you a picture of her face in full, but she has bright eyes and a wicked sharp sense of humour. I don't know if you've met young people like that who can just sort of share a sentence and have a whole room in stitches. She's a bit like that. Ruby is from the Philippines, and like many of the clients that we work with at IJM, she grew up in poverty. And Ruby was 16 years old when a recruiter offered her a job in a computer shop. But that job offer turned out to be a lie. And Ruby describes turning up at her job as being like a bomb going off as the door was locked behind her. And she was trapped and then forced to perform explicit live shows on the internet for paying customers all around the world who would pay to watch her abuse, including those here in the UK. She described it as being like being trapped in a dark room without any rays of light. A few months into her ordeal, she actually tried to escape, and she was threatened at knife point and told that if she ever tried it again, she wouldn't make it out alive. Now, sadly, Ruby's story, whilst awful, is not isolated, and she is one of thousands of children who are the victims of online sexual exploitation. And that is a crime that is every bit as dark as the title suggests and involves often very, very young children. And quite shockingly, the UK is the third largest global consumer of this sort of abuse. And when we hear stories like Ruby's, when we hear that the UK is driving the demand, it's hard to know how to respond sometimes, isn't it? And it reminds me of a scripture in Isaiah 59, just a chapter after the one that Isa kindly just read for us, where Isaiah writes this. He writes that justice is far from us and righteousness does not reach us. We look for light, but all we see is darkness, for brightness, but we walk in deep shadows. Isaiah here is describing a broken world. And I don't know about you, but that description resonates with me when we consider some of these issues like slavery, like the online exploitation of children, or indeed any of the injustices, quite frankly, that we're reading at the moment in our daily news cycle. It sometimes really feels like we look for darkness, we look for light, but all we see is darkness. Like Ruby being trapped in a dark room without any rays of light. So herein lies a challenge for us. What do we do? What do we do when justice feels, like Isaiah writes, when it feels like it's very far away? What do we do? Well, first, I believe we must all rediscover justice. So, question number one, what actually is justice? If we could move forward a couple of slides, that would be great. Thank you. What actually is justice? And in fact, if you could describe justice in a sentence or two, I wonder what you'd say. Just think about that for a moment. You know, justice is one of those weighty words. It's a word that has meant a lot to a lot of different people over a long period of time. But as Kevin Weitzman writes in his book, Pursuing Justice, justice is, at its simplest form, the single best word for capturing God's purposes for the world and humanity's calling in the world. Indeed, justice is the most consistent word that the Bible uses to speak about what ought to be. You could simplify that further to say that justice is about making wrong things right. Is there a clicker, just to say, would that be easier, just to save back and forth? Thank you. Don't worry if not. So you could simplify it further to say that justice is about making wrong things right. And this righting of wrongs, this justice, that's part of God's whole plan to achieve peace and unity and goodness and relationship with him, all to his glory. And there's a Hebrew word for this idea of peace and unity and goodness and relationship. That is a Hebrew word that's probably one that you are very familiar with. And that is the word shalom, the shalom of God. And sometimes we refer to this idea as the shalom of God. Sometimes we might think of that as just peace, like snoozing in a hammock, like staying under your duvet on a Saturday morning. But shalom in the Bible is much, much more than that. Rather, shalom in the Bible, oh, thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you. That's really kind. Thank you. That's super. Thank you. Thank you. So shalom in the Bible is much more than just sort of peace in a hammock. You see, shalom in the Bible is this intended state of wholeness and wellness that all of creation is meant to experience. It is the active presence of what is right and what is nourishing, what is true, what is joyful. It's a state of things as they ought to be, or in other words, justice. Are you with me? Now, there are two Hebrew words that I would love to introduce us to help us to understand this a little bit better. And there are two words that are commonly used for justice in the Old Testament. The first of our Hebrew words is the word mishpat. Can you say that with me? Mishpat. Brilliant. And this word appears over 200 times in the Old Testament alone. And this word is all about how we treat people equitably. Note, not equally. Equitably and fairly. And mishpat is also sometimes known as rectifying justice. And it means giving people what they deserve, whether that be punishment or protection or care given to people, all people, equitably and fairly. And a mishpat also means justice as in the rule of law. In other words, having the same mishpat for the foreigner as the native, applying the same laws and the same rules to them both. It looks like not having one rule for the rich and another law for the poor. It means bringing about the correct punishment under law, regardless of your race or your status or your wealth. And this understanding of justice as being an active means of help and an active means of assistance, we see all the way through Scripture. For example, in Psalm 146, we read this: He upholds the cause through mishpat, through the rule of law, of the oppressed. And we see that the word mishpat here, that God is showing particular concern for the protection and the provision of the law for those who are being oppressed. In the use of this word, mishpat, we're seeing this emphasis of the rule of law coming through. And a writer called Oliver O'Donovan writes about this a lot in his book. What's it called? His book? Let me remind myself. The Desire of the Nation. Sorry. And he writes this. He writes, when Amos calls for mishpat to roll like a river, very famous verse, what he means precisely is that the stream of judicial activity should not be allowed to dry up. He's emphasizing the use of mishpat in relation to the rule of law and specifically having a functioning judicial system. So in other words, Amos isn't just calling for justice in a sort of general sense, but in a very specific sense. It's about the law courts being open and being functional and available for all people, rich, poor, regardless of wealth or status, and so on. So to recap, mishpat, or rectifying justice, is about having a fair rule of law delivered equitably and impartially, and giving people their rights and what they're due, whether that be protection or provision or care, regardless of wealth and status. That's our first type of justice that we find. But that isn't the only type of justice that we find in the Bible. Because you see, our understanding of how God's justice is meant to play out in the world is actually reinforced by a second Hebrew word that, again, we find throughout the Bible. And the second Hebrew word is the word tzedakah. Can you say that with me? Tzedakah. And this word is a little bit different. So it's all about relationships. And it's also known as primary justice. And it's a word that is sometimes also translated in the Bible as being righteous. But it also carries the meaning of being just, or as Alec Motcher puts it, right with God, being right with God, and therefore committed to putting right all other relationships. This word refers to living a life of right relationship with God and therefore right relationship with others in society. And it also kind of carries a sort of sense of regulating in power balances and between humans and in society. And the thing is about this type of justice this tzedakah justice, is that if you have this type of justice, i.e. relational justice, where people act in a good way towards other people, it renders mishpat, the other type of justice, we wouldn't need it, right? Because you wouldn't have wrongdoers to punish, you wouldn't have victims to care for, because everybody is living in right relationship already. Does that make sense? Now, Tim Keller is really helpfully highlights that when these two words are put together, which is sometimes translated as justice and righteousness, and we see them put together time and time and time again in the Bible, the best translation that we probably have for this nowadays is the phrase social justice, a phrase that we're all very familiar with, I'm sure, which again points us back to this idea that justice is inherently relational. It's inherently got people at the heart of it. Mishpat and tzedakah, social justice. Now, what I think is fascinating is that time and time again in the Bible, we see these two terms used in relation to four main people groups. Those are those who are poor, the foreigner, the widow or single parents, and orphans or vulnerable children, which is sometimes known as the quartet of the vulnerable. Now, in a biblical society, these would have been the people who were most vulnerable. In a patriarchal farming society, these would have been those who didn't have the protection of a male relative or land to provide for them. And it's got me thinking, I wonder who this might include today. Perhaps we could expand that quartet somewhat to include those who are homeless, perhaps. The refugee, perhaps. The Dalit family forced to work in a rock quarry in India, perhaps. The 14-year-old girl from Albania who came to the UK desperate for a job, but who's now trapped in a brothel. Sadly, the list could go on. So, according to the Bible, one way to tell whether we're seeking mishpat and tzedakah justice is going to be seen in how we treat this people group, the quartet of the vulnerable. And here's the challenging thing about justice. You see, justice cannot exist in a vacuum. Justice is not just a concept. It is not something we can merely think about. You can't merely hypothesize justice. It's like in Micah says, in Micah 6:8, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. It's act justly, not just think justly. Or at the start of Isaiah, where Isaiah writes, learn to do justice, defend the oppressed. It's do justice, not just imagine justice. Justice is something we must actively do. Theologian Fleming Rutledge puts it like this. She writes, when we read that God is just and righteous, this doesn't refer to a threatening, abstract quality that God has over us. It is much more like a verb than a noun because it refers to the power of God to actively make right what has been wrong. Justice is much more a verb than a noun. It's a doing word. It is something that is enacted on behalf of those who are vulnerable. So, we have our two key words for justice from the Bible. We have mishpat and tzedakah, a holistic picture of social justice. And when they're acted out, they move us more towards that state of shalom and how God intended us to flourish, things as they ought to be. And when we start to examine the arc of Scripture, woven throughout, we see justice is like a golden thread. From Genesis, right at the start, we see humans are created in the image of God and they are all equal. In the words of theologian Isabel Hamley, we cannot speak of justice unless it is anchored in the nature of God revealed in creation. And we cannot speak of justice unless we engage seriously with the fact that every single human being, however objectionable, unpleasant, strange, offensive, uncomfortable, or different, is made in the image of God. That is the starting point. All people everywhere are made in the image of God. But from Genesis, we move to the Exodus story, where we hear God hearing the cry of his people trapped in slavery and then being moved to respond. We see that God is a God who cares deeply, and not only just about the spiritual state of his people, but the physical state of his people trapped in slavery too. And of course, Exodus is used throughout Scripture as a wider example of God's redemption and freedom from slavery to sin. But the law frequently references back to the Exodus story to encourage God's people in their pursuit of justice. He says, basically, you were once slaves in Egypt. You were once vulnerable. So you know what it's like. Treat others right. Treat others with justice. And then throughout the Old Testament, we see leads us into the prophets who speak truth to power. They call God's people back to the ideal of justice and of righteousness. They call out hypocrisy and worship, saying that, if you're worshiping God, but you're not seeking justice for the most vulnerable, then you've got it wrong. And they point to the coming of a righteous king who will embody justice and righteousness in all its fullness. Now, fast forward 400 years and quite a few pages later, this happens and this righteous king arrives in the person of Jesus. And his first words, his manifesto of ministry in Luke chapter 4, shows that his priorities are not only spiritual, but they have radical justice consequences. His good news has both eternal and literal bearing. For the hungry, there will be food. For the captive, there will be freedom. For the hurting in the morning, there will be joy. And while Jesus is clearly preaching good news to all, he showed throughout his ministry that he had particular interest in the poor and the downtrodden, like God has always had. He challenged political and economic systems of injustice. He fed hungry people, sometimes 5,000 at a time. Jesus, in his incarnation, moved in with the poor. He lived with, he ate with, he associated with the socially ostracized, the outcast, those on the margins. And in his life, his death, and his resurrection, he begins to usher in the coming kingdom where justice is right at the center. And then we see an early church who turned the world upside down in this radical revolution of love, this movement of generosity, sharing with all who had need, welcoming the poor, the lonely, again, the outcast, the downtrodden, are brought into the center of community. And then we see as we move through the New Testament, there's so much justice. The book of James is a brilliant example, as James speaks powerfully about the importance of deeds as well as words when it comes to following Jesus. It's a throwback to the prophets again in the Old Testament. And then comes Revelation, which points us forward to what is to come, the promise of a coming kingdom where justice and righteousness, the foundation of God's throne, will permeate every part of the new creation. Wow. Justice is unavoidable in the Scriptures. It is laced through every part. Some fun facts. In the Old Testament, justice is the second most talked about theme after idolatry. In the New Testament, 1 in every 16 verses is about justice. In the 3 synoptic gospels, it's 1 in every 10. In the book of Luke, it's 1 in every 7. Justice is absolutely central I love how Krish Kandaya puts it when he says, looking for justice in the Bible is a bit like asking, where's the university in Oxford? It's everywhere. It is all around you. If we want to care about what God cares about, justice is a great place to start. It is everywhere. So, we've defined what biblical justice is. We've seen how it's a combination of structural, judicial, rule of law combined with right relationships between people. And we've seen how the narrative of justice is woven throughout Scripture. And so now I'd love us to change gears slightly. We're going to zoom in on one specific form of injustice today. It's one specific area of justice where we definitely, desperately need mishpat and tzedakah to come in to bring that shalom. And that is the injustice of slavery. Now, if you're anything like me, I learned about slavery in my history lessons at school. I don't know if that's the same with anyone else. But if when you hear the word slavery, your picture in your mind's eye is in black and white, then sadly that needs fast updating into full colour, because slavery today is alive and well. It just looks a little different to what it used to before. You see, modern slavery in the 21st century is only very rarely what slavery was before the 19th century. You see, before then, slavery was called chattel slavery, where one person legally owned another as their property. Now, that cannot happen in most places around the world today. Instead, what happens nowadays is that people are treated as if they were property. Their humanity, their autonomy, their dignity, their freedom is denied, or stolen, and disposed of, all for the profit of another. Let me share some headlines about modern slavery with you. Stay with me here, because it's important that you know that there are currently an estimated 50 million people in slavery today. That is estimated to be more than at any other point since records began. And that is about the same as the population of Spain, roughly. Slavery just looks very different to how it used to. Slavery today, it looks like whole families forced to work in rock quarries in South Asia or in sweatshops in Bangladesh. It looks like child slavery on fishing boats in Ghana or on cocoa plantations, when they should be in school. It looks like sexual exploitation. Young women trafficked from Romania to London or abused online like Ruby was. Slavery is close. It can be woven into the shirt that you're wearing. It can be as close as the coffee beans you are drinking, the laptop that you use. And to put that big figure in context, one in every four of that 50 million people are children. That is the equivalent of every child here in England and Wales in slavery around the world. And although slavery takes many forms, there is one common factor that underpins it all, and that is violence. You see, slavery is perpetuated by violence and threats of violence. Violence is used to force victims to comply and to associate non-compliance with the basic human emotions of pain and fear. And it is absolutely shocking. For example, Come with me now or I'll hit you. Do this or I'll kill you. Or rape you. Or maybe I'll actually kill her and rape you so you know I'm serious. Or I'll do the same to your family if you ever disobey me. Sometimes the deception is far more attractive on the surface. I'll help you get a great job in the UK so that you can send money home to your family. But the job turns out to be in a brothel. Take these drugs to this location or I'll hand you over to the police as an illegal immigrant. Wash this car or you'll never get your passport back. Do you want me to report you to the Home Office? Tell anyone and you'll never walk again. Do you really want to go back to being homeless? At least there you have a shelter and a job. No, you can't go home. Sleep here in the shed so I can take you to work first thing tomorrow. And yes, we'll lock the door. And of course, we'll pay you. Maybe next week. Don't talk to me about minimum wage. It does not apply to you. Now get your little sister to come next time too. You know I love you. Come on holiday with me to the UK. It will be great. No, you can't go home. A girl like you is far too valuable. This is what it looks and sounds like, literally. Many of the examples I've just given are from directly first-hand evidence from IJM and other organisations working on these cases. My colleagues and I have frequently seen people enduring a sustained level of abuse and violence that most of us could not even imagine for a minute. And it is happening here in the UK in 2023 today. And there is something about the violent nature of slavery which makes it different from almost every other justice and development issue. Because you can't just address it with the normal solutions of food or shelter or schools or medicine. You see, this sort of violence abuse that slavery involves is different because it is intentional. For example, sex trafficking, intentionally luring young girls away. When we find them, we find that they are not there by accident. They are not suffering because of bad luck or a bad storm or a poor harvest. They are suffering because violent people want them to suffer. And perhaps some of those most intentional people are the tourists visiting mainly locations in the global south where they plan and they get on a plane and they think about it. Violence is intentional. It is a different kind of problem. Secondly, it is scary. You know, unlike poor sanitation or hunger, if you try to fight the problem, it will fight back. In leading operations to bring victims to safety, my colleagues have found themselves attacked by mobs. They found vehicles smashed up by rocks and bricks. They've even been tried to thrown under trains. One of my colleagues was even murdered in the midst of this work a few years ago. By nature, violence fights back. And what that means is that the problem is very scary. And so it leaves many of the world's most vulnerable facing it utterly alone, because it is too scary for others to step into alongside them. Does that make sense? And the third thing about it is that it leaves really, really deep scars. You see, even after the visible wounds have healed, the violation, the humiliation, the betrayal, these often remain. And these invisible scars of slavery are often very hard for you and me to see. They are scars of degradation and of shame. And this makes this problem a little bit different again. And it demonstrates that it is not enough for us to just treat the symptoms after the event. We must stop the violence before it attacks. So if you want to address the injustice of slavery, we have to stop the violence. The question is, how? What can we do? Now, there are lots and lots of complex reasons as to why slavery and human trafficking happens. But very, very simply, we see that most commonly slavery occurs when those who are vulnerable, and that could be for many reasons, vulnerable due to conflict or poverty or gender or age or social status, when those who are vulnerable meet those who are violent and greedy, who think they can get away with it, or in other words, act with impunity, slavery occurs. That is a gross oversimplification in some ways, but that tends to be the pattern if you were going to boil it down into a simple formula. Those who are vulnerable meet those who are violent and greedy, who think they can get away with it. Now, the really righteous part of me thinks what we probably need is just some good laws. Just some good laws to help us out. But the good news is that for the first time in human history, all slavery, including forms of trafficking, is illegal everywhere. That's thanks to the global church. You know, people like William Wilberforce and Aluda Equiano, that the people of God, the abolitionists, you know, slavery is now illegal across the world in pretty much every single country across the globe. Praise God. But what doesn't necessarily exist is the systems to enforce the law. Mishpat, justice, is lacking. So what that looks like is that you can bring a little girl who has been trafficked into a brothel into freedom, which we should 100% do. But if the system to enforce the law is lacking, then you create a vacuum and that brothel still operates and another girl is just trafficked in to her place, and then essentially you have two victims on your hands, right? Similarly, you can have all the aftercare programs you need set up to care for survivors and to support them, which we absolutely need and want. But if the perpetrator is still out there offending and acting with impunity and using false debts to trap families into factories, then that aftercare shelter is always going to be full. So something else needs to be done to end the cycle of violence. We must affect systemic change. We must stop this happening in the first place. We must make society safe. So, back to our equation here. What IJM have found over the last 25 years or so of working on the front line to address this issue of violence, that in order to make real, lasting, systemic change, you have to address the systems that allow injustice and slavery to keep on going. And that looks like a lot of different things, but it often starts here. The think they can get away with it bit. In other words, holding criminals to account and ending the impunity. It turns out that slave owners aren't particularly brave or courageous. They're just in a lucrative business. So suddenly when there's a cost to pay, when they can no longer get away with it, we see the dial begin to shift. I'm going to share a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So what this looks like for IJM, and what we do is we work with local police and authorities to actually find where victims are and work to bring them to safety, bring them into freedom. But then what we do is we hold the perpetrators accountable. We work with the justice systems, with the courts of law, and with legal teams to actually make sure that the perpetrators cannot harm others, to ensure the laws that exist on paper actually are acted out in reality, ensuring that mishpat justice is present. We then support survivors in their journey of healing and freedom to ensure that they are no longer vulnerable, to ensure they can flourish and thrive. And then we work to identify gaps in the system and work to fix those gaps. And does it work? Quite simply, yes. We find that when you combine casework to find victims and individuals, to bring them into freedom, to support them, to ensure that they can flourish and they're safe, when you combine that with actually working on the other end, working with systems of law and government to ensure that those laws are upheld, that they're actually making a difference for those who they're intended for, and working to fix the broken system, we find it is possible to affect massive systemic change. And I'd like to, if I may, just share a brief case study with you, hopefully to encourage you that there is good news when it comes to injustice. And to do that, I would like to take you back about 12 or so years to the Philippines and to the city of Cebu. Now, when IJM first started working there, this city was pretty much known as the global epicenter of child sex trafficking, and particularly that of really young children. So I'm told you could be in a taxi from the airport to the red light district in around about 30 minutes. And children were openly marketed in the streets. Foreign tourists flocked there, including here from the UK, knowing that they could do whatever they do and get away with it. This slide here represents children who are being trafficked in the Philippines, in this city. So IJM, we set about doing our job. We set about working with the police to find where these children were, to work to actually bring them to safety and to support them, and then working to actually hold the criminals to account and to strengthen the whole justice system, to train the local authorities, to train the social workers, and ensure that the laws that were on paper were actually being enacted. And during this time, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually commissioned a piece of academic research into this work. And they estimated that by doing our work, by stopping the criminals, that a great goal would be a 20% reduction in the trafficking of children in that city. That would have been a really, really great breakthrough. We had a 4-year project. We began finding where the children were, one by one, working with police to bring them to safety. And we began working to look at the systems and the structures, finding out who really wanted to make a difference, working with them to take the cases through the court system. And we got our first conviction of a trafficker, and we began to see more and more convictions coming through. We began training police and magistrates and social workers and so on. And here's what you need to know. The tide began to turn. This is what the Gates Foundation found. Remember, the aim was a 20% reduction. So in a 4-year period, they found a 72% reduction in child trafficking into the sex trade in Cebu. That was actually then followed by a 75% and an 86% reduction in 2 other major cities in the nation. And the academics cited 2 key reasons for this. They said, number one, there are a number of kind of kingpins, key criminals who are now behind bars, who actually, they weren't on the streets anymore, just facilitating this awful abuse. And then the second reason was the multiplier effect. You called it a shadow effect earlier, the multiplier effect, where actually words had got out there that you could no longer get away with it, that this was not going to be tolerated, that this could not be done. But we would cite another reason as well. And that is that for the nation of the Philippines, we saw an incredible move of prayer for this project. We saw people around the world at the time get passionate about this issue in this place, passionate about seeing vulnerable children kept safe and free, and praying for transformation to come. 4 years, 72% reduction. That's remarkable, isn't it? Now, fast forward a few years now, this transformation has actually been replicated in 9 different locations around the world. We know the model works. And now we're working towards a massive vision towards 2030 of seeing 500 million people kept safe from slavery. It's a huge vision, but we know it's possible to affect systemic change. Now, has it been easy? Absolutely not. No, of course not. Has it been a quick fix? No, 4 years, that's remarkable, but working with local police and local justice systems is incredibly complex. But by persevering, we're seeing that it is possible. In this area in the Philippines, but in places around the world, it is possible to affect massive systemic change. So much so that in actually quite a few of these locations that you can see, IGM have actually moved on to completely different work or to completely different locations. And that is the aim, really, is to do ourselves out of a job, to fix the broken system, to move on, to do ourselves out of a job. And over the past few years, these words from IJM's founder, Gary Haugen, have really encouraged me in the area of persevering, of keeping on going when things are tough. He says this, he says, the victims of injustice in our world do not need our spasms of passion. They need our long obedience in the same direction. They need our legs and lungs of endurance, and they need sturdy stores of joy. This is a long work. This is a long walk of obedience in the same direction. But we're seeing it really is possible to affect systemic change, so much so that we might actually be able to say that slavery could be consigned to the history lessons for good. So what's our response? We have explored what justice is and a biblical view of justice. We've explored how justice is woven throughout the scriptures. And then we've explored one specific area of injustice, the example of slavery, and how systemic change is possible and indeed actually happening. But how do each of us in our own contexts, how do we go about doing this mishpat and sadika stuff day by day, day in, day out? And the honest answer is there is not just one single tick in the box activity that we can do, but rather there is a much more holistic spectrum that we can engage in. As Tim Keller says, justice consists of a broad range of activities, from simple, fair and honest dealings with people in daily life, to regular, radical, generous giving of your time and resources, to activism that seeks to end particular forms of injustice, violence and oppression. But it's a broad range. And I'm really aware that in the room today, we will have a whole host of injustices that you will feel passionate about and that you will be involved in. And I hope and pray that you feel encouraged this morning, that justice is really on God's heart. And whether you're passionate about seeing an end to poverty, to climate change, to supporting refugees, to ending homelessness, to ending modern slavery. The list could go on. There is not one single activity of justice that will encompass the entirety of Mishpat and Tzedakah that we seek. But rather, justice is the sum of many parts and is always going to be the work of a community. I like to think of it like justice is a mosaic. And, if you were to take out a single tile, that in itself wouldn't be the picture. But when you put them lots of little tiles next to each other, it makes a complete picture that paints a beautiful, beautiful work of art. Together we can make a stunning whole. Now, in a moment, we are going to bring this section into a close by watching a video. And then we're going to take a break so you can refill on pastries and coffee and digest a little bit. But I did want to leave you with some practical things that you can do if, particularly this morning as I'm speaking, if like me, this issue of modern slavery has gripped your heart. There are a couple of really practical things you can do. And the first thing I would say is to continue to get aware. You being here this morning, you are not hiding from the uncomfortable truth. You are making yourselves aware. But two really helpful resources that I've found. First of all is this book here, The Good News About Injustice. When I first read this book, it turned my world upside down. And it was part of the start of my journey into feeling really called to the work of justice. It's by Gary Haugen, who actually founded IJM. A foreword by John Stott, that's always good. And it's a really, really great both story of justice and theology of justice. I would really recommend that. And for the more sort of development-minded of you, The Locust Effect is a slightly more academic text, but particularly unpacking the issue of violence in relation to poverty and modern slavery. So it's a really, really helpful, insightful, challenging read, but those would be good places to start. If you check out the IJM website, which I'll pop on up in a moment, there's loads of resources to help you engage as an individual, as a church, in prayer, TED Talks, and so on for you to watch. Do grab me if you're interested, I can jot some ideas down. And also at the back, we've got a load of resources that good friends Colin and Judith, give us a little wave, who are amazing IJM friends and supporters who will help you engage with as well. So number one, I would say keep getting aware. That is a really, really good place to start. These things exist in the shadows. Let's bring them into the light and get aware. Number two, we really covet your prayer. Some of you will know this about IJM, but at IJM, every staff member all around the world, we spend an hour a day in prayer. And I want to invite you into that, not necessarily an hour a day, that's a lot, but it really is where we see the front line of this work. Slavery is one of the most abusive, I believe, demonic ways that the devil tries to destroy people. It is, preying on the greed that exists in man's heart to exploit and keep others down. We need a move of prayer to see this come to an end. And our team can only go into really difficult and dangerous places, knowing that there's a global family around them praying. And again, you can sign up to do that on the website. I've got some cards out the back. If you jot down your details, then we'll loop you into the prayer updates. And the third thing that you can do, some of you might feel moved to give towards this work. It might be that you're choosing an organisation this Christmas as a family, or you're thinking, you know what, I could give monthly. And if that is you, I'd love to invite you to consider doing that and becoming a Freedom Partner today. Those are the people that actually help provide the legal support, the resource to investigate and find where people are. I know we have some amazing Freedom Partners in the room today anyway, so thank you. You can choose any amount you want. What we pray for, honestly, is consistency, because it helps us to plan. So whether it's £10 or £100, completely up to you. But that is one really practical thing. If today you've got that nudge and you say, you know what, I want to put some of my resources towards seeing this work come. And again, you can do that online. I've put some forms out the back. And also, as a community over the next few months, there's quite an exciting project that's starting here, which is to raise the equivalent of a rescue operation across Harrogate. That is £7,500, which is really exciting. And if you sign up to be a Freedom Partner, then you can kind of loop into that as well and be part of that story too. I'll leave the details up afterwards. Right, I'm going to take a deep breath in a moment. In a moment, we are going to watch that video before we break, and then time for questions and discussion. You might want to use that break to ask God, how might I respond this morning? That would be a really lovely question to ask. But before we do, I started by sharing with you Ruby's story. And it took a remarkable turn. You see, after she tried to escape, in her desperation, she prayed, God, if you're real, get me out of here. The very next day, IJM and local police found Ruby and were able to bring her and 5 other girls out into freedom and into safety. And her trafficker is now behind bars and cannot harm any young girls. Her story is part of a much longer story that's been written in her region and in Southeast Asia and around the world as we work to end online sexual exploitation. But a little while ago, Ruby was actually invited to come and speak to the UK Parliament about her experience in light of the online safety bill. And she was so courageous as she told this vulnerable story. And she told that story from a position of not being a victim, but of being a survivor. And she told about how she was flourishing and thriving, but she also called MPs to account. She said this, she said, will you change the world, not just with your opinions, but with your example? Isn't that amazing? I found that incredibly challenging and inspiring. And so as we close, my prayer today is that you would know that in whatever sphere you find yourself in, that you are invited to be part of the story of justice all around the world. And so I'd like to leave you with a thought. It's both a comfort and a challenge. And that is that you cannot do everything, but you must do something. And so the question is this, what will your something be today? How will you take a step towards making the justice of God available to everybody? How will you be part of the story of ushering in the kingdom of God by bringing his mishpat and his tzedakah to our communities and the world today? Maybe through prayer, maybe through giving, maybe something completely different. But how will you play your part today? Thank you.